War and Peace, Book 6, Chapter 14, read for LibriVox.org by Robbie Rogers. On the 31st of December, New Year's Eve, 1809-1810, an old grande of Catherine's day was giving a ball and midnight supper. The diplomatic corps and the Emperor himself were to be present. The grande's well-known mansion on the English quay glittered with innumerable lights. Police were stationed at the brightly lit entrance, which was carpeted with red baize, and not only gendarmes but dozens of police officers, and even the police master himself, stood at the porch. Carriages kept driving away and fresh ones arriving, with red-liveried footmen and footmen in plumed hats. From the carriages emerged men wearing uniforms, stars, and ribbons, while ladies in satin and ermine cautiously descended the carriage steps, which were let down for them with a clatter, and then walked hurriedly and noiselessly over the baize at the entrance. Almost every time a new carriage drove up, a whisper ran through the crowd, and caps were doffed. The Emperor? No, a minister. Prince, ambassador. Don't you see the plumes? Was whispered among the crowd. One person, better dressed than the rest, seemed to know everyone and mentioned by name the greatest dignitaries of the day. A third of the visitors had already arrived, but the Rostovs, who were to be present, were still hurrying to get dressed. There had been many discussions and preparations for this ball in the Rostov family, many fears that the invitation would not arrive, that the dresses would not be ready, or that something would not be arranged as it should be. Marya Ignatieva Perenskaya, a thin and sallow maid of honor at the court of the Dowager Empress, who was a friend and relation of the Countess and piloted the provincial Rostovs in Petersburg high society, was to accompany them to the ball. They were to call for her at her home in the Taurida Gardens at 10 o'clock, but it was already 5 minutes to 10 and the girls were not yet dressed. Natasha was going to her first grand ball. She had got up at 8 that morning and had been in a fever of excitement and activity all day. All her power since morning had been concentrated on assuring that they all, she herself, Mamma, and Sonia, should be as well dressed as possible. Sonia and her mother put themselves entirely in her hands. The Countess was to wear a claret-covered velvet dress, and the two girls white gauze over pink silk slips with roses on their bodices, and their hair dressed a la grecque. Everything essential had already been done. Feet, hands, necks, and ears washed, perfumed, and powdered, as befits a ball. The open silk stockings and white satin shoes with ribbons were already on. The hairdressing was almost done. Sonia was finishing dressing, and so was the Countess, but Natasha, who had bustled about helping them all, was behindhand. She was still sitting before a looking-glass with a dressing jacket thrown over her slender shoulders. Sonia stood ready dressed in the middle of the room and, pressing the head of a pin till it hurt her dainty finger, was fixing on a last ribbon that squeaked as the pin went through it. "That's not the way, that's not the way, Sonia," cried Natasha, turning her head and clutching both hands at her hair, which the maid who was dressing it had not had time to release. "That bow is not right. Come here." Sonia sat down and Natasha pinned the ribbon on differently. "Allow me, miss. I can't do it like that," said the maid who was holding Natasha's hair. "Oh, dear, well then, wait. That's right, Sonia." "Aren't you ready? It is nearly 10, came the Countess's voice. "Directly, directly. And you, Mamma?" "I have only my cap to pin on." "Don't do it without me," called Natasha. "You won't do it right." "But it's already 10. They had decided to be at the ball by 10:30, and Natasha had still to get dressed, and they had to call at Taurida Gardens. When her hair was done, Natasha, in her short petticoat from under which her dancing shoes showed, and in her mother's dressing jacket, ran up to Sonia, scrutinized her, then ran to her mother. Turning her mother's head this way and that, she fastened on the cap, and hurriedly kissing her gray hair, ran back to the maids who were turning up the hem of her skirt. The cause of the delay was Natasha's skirt, which was too long. Two maids were turning up the hem and hurriedly biting off the ends of thread. A third, with pins in her mouth, was running between the Countess and Sonia, and a fourth held the whole of the gossamer garment up high on one uplifted hand. "Marva, quicker, darling! Give me my thimble, miss, from there. "Whenever will you be ready?" asked the Count, coming up to the door. "Here is some scent. Perenskaya must be tired of waiting." "It's ready, miss," said the maid, holding up the shortened gauze dress with 2 fingers, and blowing and shaking something off it, as if by this to express a consciousness of the airiness and purity of what she held. Natásha began putting on the dress. In a minute, don't come in, Papa," she called to her father as he opened the door, speaking from under the filmy skirt which still covered her whole face. Sónya slammed the door to. A minute later they let the Count in. He was wearing a blue swallowtail coat, shoes and stockings, and was perfumed and his hair pomaded. "Oh, Papa, how nice you look! Charming!" cried Natásha, as she stood in the middle of the room, smoothing out the folds of the gauze. "If you please, miss, allow me," said the maid, who, on her knees, was pulling the skirt straight and shifting the pins from one side of her mouth to the other with her tongue. "Say what you like!" exclaimed Sónya in a despairing voice as she looked at Natásha. "Say what you like, it's still too long." Natásha stepped back to look at herself in the pier glass. The dress was too long. "Really, Mamma, really, Madame, it is not at all too long," said Marva, crawling on her knees after her young lady. "Well, if it's too long, we'll take it up. We'll tack it up in 1 minute," said the resolute Dunyásha, taking a pin that was stuck in the front of her little shawl, and still kneeling on the floor, set to work once more. At that moment, with soft steps, the countess came in shyly, in her cap and velvet gown. "Oh, my beauty!" exclaimed the count. "She looks better than any of you." He would have embraced her, but, blushing, she stepped aside, fearing to be rumpled. "Mamma, your cap! More to this side," said Natásha. "I'll arrange it," and she rushed forward so that the maids who were tacking up her skirt could not move fast enough, and a piece of gauze was torn off. "Oh, goodness, what has happened? Really, it was not my fault." "Never mind, I'll turn it up, it won't show," said Dunyásha. "What a beauty, a very queen," said the nurse as she came to the door. "And Sónya, they are lovely." At 10:15 they at last got into the carriages and started, but they still had to call at Taurida Gardens. Perenskaya was quite ready. In spite of her age and plainness, she had gone through the same process as the Rostóvs, but with less flurry, for to her it was a matter of routine. Her ugly old body was washed, perfumed, and powdered in just the same way. She had washed behind her ears just as carefully, and when she entered her drawing room in her yellow dress, wearing her badge of maid of honor, her old lady's maid was as full of rapturous admiration as the Rostov servants had been. She praised the Rostóvs' toilets, they praised her taste in toilet, and at 11 o'clock, careful of their coiffures and dresses, they settled themselves into their carriages and drove off. End of chapter 14. War and Peace, Book 6, Chapter 15. Read for LibriVox.org by Robbie Rogers. Natásha had not had a moment free since early morning, and had not once had time to think of what lay before her. In the damp, chill air and crowded closeness of the swaying carriage, she for the first time vividly imagined what was in store for her there at the ball, in those brightly lighted rooms, with music, flowers, dances, the Emperor, and all the brilliant young people of Petersburg. The prospect was so splendid that she hardly believed it would come true, so out of keeping was it with the chill darkness and closeness of the carriage. She understood all that awaited her only when, after stepping over the red baize at the entrance, she entered the hall, took off her fur cloak, and, beside Sónya and in front of her mother, mounted the brilliantly illuminated stairs between the flowers. Only then did she remember how she must behave at a ball, and tried to assume the majestic air she considered indispensable for a girl on such an occasion. But fortunately for her, she felt her eyes growing misty. She saw nothing clearly, her pulse beat 100 to the minute, and the blood throbbed at her heart. She could not assume that pose, which would have made her ridiculous, and she moved on almost fainting from excitement, and trying with all her might to conceal it. And this was the very attitude that became her best. Before and behind them other visitors were entering, also talking in low tones and wearing ball dresses. The mirrors on the landing reflected ladies in white, pale blue and pink dresses, with diamonds and pearls on their bare necks and arms. Natásha looked in the mirrors and could not distinguish her reflection from the others. All was blended into one brilliant procession. On entering the ballroom, the regular hum of voices, footsteps, and greetings deafened Natásha, and the light and glitter dazzled her still more. The host and hostess, who had already been standing at the door for half an hour, repeating the same words to the various arrivals, "Charmé de vous voir," greeted the Rostóvs and Perónskaya in the same manner. "Delighted to see you." The two girls in their white dresses, each with a rose in her black hair, both curtsied in the same way, but the hostess's eye involuntarily rested longer on the slim Natásha. She looked at her and gave her alone a special smile in addition to her usual smile as hostess. Looking at her, she may have recalled the golden, irrecoverable days of her own girlhood and her own first ball. The host also followed Natásha with his eyes and asked the count which was his daughter. "Charming," said he, kissing the tips of his fingers. In the ballroom, guests stood crowding at the entrance doors, awaiting the Emperor. The countess took up a position in one of the front rows of that crowd. Natásha heard and felt that several people were asking about her and looking at her. She realized that those noticing her liked her, and this observation helped to calm her. "There are some like ourselves and some worse," she thought. Perónskaya was pointing out to the countess the most important people at the ball. "That is the Dutch ambassador, do you see? That gray-haired man," she said, indicating an old man with a profusion of silver-gray curly hair who was surrounded by ladies laughing at something he said. "Ah, here she is, the Queen of Petersburg, Countess Bezúkhova," said Perónskaya, indicating Hélène who had just entered. "How lovely! She is quite equal to Márya Antónovna. See how the men, young and old, pay court to her. Beautiful and clever. They say Prince is quite mad about her. But see those two? Even though not good-looking, they are even more run after." She pointed to a lady who was crossing the room, followed by a very plain daughter. "She is a splendid match, a millionaire," said Perónskaya. "And look, here come her suitors." "That is Bezúkhova's brother, Anatoly Kurágin," she said, indicating a handsome officer of the Horse Guards, who passed by them with head erect, looking at something over the heads of the ladies. "He's handsome, isn't he? I hear they will marry him to that rich girl. But your cousin, Drubetskóya, is also very attractive to her. They say she has millions. Oh, yes, that's the French ambassador himself," she replied to the countess's inquiry about Caulaincourt. "Looks as if he were a king. All the same, the French are charming, very charming. No one more charming in society. Ah, here she is. Yes, she is still the most beautiful of them all, our Márya Antónovna. And how simply she is dressed. Lovely. And that stout one in spectacles is the universal Freemason," she went on, indicating Pierre. "Put him beside his wife and he looks like a regular buffoon." Pierre, swaying his stout body, advanced, making way through the crowd and nodding to his right and left, as casually and as good-naturedly as if he were passing through a crowd at the fair. He pushed through, evidently looking for someone. Natásha looked joyfully at the familiar face of Pierre, the buffoon as Perónskaya had just called him, and knew he was looking for them, and for her in particular. He had promised to be at the ball and introduce partners to her. But before he reached them, Pierre stopped beside a very handsome dark young man of middle height and in a white uniform, who stood by a window talking to a tall man wearing stars and a ribbon. Natásha at once recognized the shorter and younger man in the white uniform. It was Bolkónski, who seemed to her to have grown much younger, happier, and better looking. "There's someone else we know, Bolkónski, do you see, Mamma?" said Natásha, pointing out Prince Andrew. "You remember, he stayed with us a night at Otradno." "Oh, do you know him?" said Perónskaya. "I can't bear him. Il fait présent la pluie et le beau temps. He's too proud for anything. Takes after his father. And he's hand in glove with Speransky, writing some project or other. Just look at how he treats the ladies. There's one talking to him and he has turned away," she said, pointing at him. "I'd give it to him if he treated me as he does those ladies." He is all the rage just now. End of chapter 15.
War and Peace, Book 6, Chapter 16. Read for LibriVox.org by Eva Harnick. Suddenly everybody stirred, began talking, and pressed forward and then back, and between the two rows which separated, the Emperor entered to the sounds of music that had immediately struck up. Behind him walked his host and hostess. He walked in rapidly, bowing to right and left, as if anxious to get the first movements of the reception over. The band played the polonaise, in vogue at that time on account of the words that had been set to it, beginning "Alexander, Elizaveta, all our hearts you ravish quite." The Emperor passed on to the drawing-room. The crowd made a rush for the doors, and several persons with excited faces hurried there and back again. Then the crowd hastily retired from the drawing-room door, at which the Emperor reappeared, talking to the hostess. A young man, looking distraught, pounced down on the ladies, asking them to move aside. Some ladies, with faces betraying complete forgetfulness of all the rules of decorum, pushed forward to the detriment of their toilets. The men began to choose partners and take their places for the polonaise. Everyone moved back, and the Emperor came smiling out of the drawing-room, leading his hostess by the hand, but not keeping time to the music. The host was followed with Maria Antonovna Narzhinskina. Then came ambassadors, ministers, and various generals, whom Peronskaya diligently named. More than half the ladies already had partners and were taking up or preparing to take up their positions for the polonaise. Natásha felt that she would be left with her mother and Sónya among a minority of women who crowded near the wall, not having been invited to dance. She stood with her slender arms hanging down, her scarcely defined bosom rising and falling regularly, and with bated breath and glittering, frightened eyes gazed straight before her, evidently prepared for the height of joy or misery. She was not concerned about the Emperor or any of those great people whom Peronskaya was pointing out. She had but one thought. Is it possible, no one will ask me, that I shall not be among the first to dance? Is it possible that not one of all these men will notice me? They do not even seem to see me, or if they do, they look as if they were saying, "Ah, she's not the one I am after, so it is not worth looking at her." No, it is impossible, she thought. They must know how I long to dance, how splendidly I dance, and how they would enjoy dancing with me. The strains of the polonaise, which had continued for a considerable time, had begun to sound like a sad reminiscence to Natásha's ears. She wanted to cry. Peronskaya had left them. The count was at the other end of the room. She and the countess and Sónya were standing by themselves, as in the depths of a forest, amid that crowd of strangers, with no one interested in them and not wanted by anyone. Prince Andrew with a lady passed by, evidently not recognizing them. The handsome Anatole was smilingly talking to a partner on his arm and looked at Natásha as one looks at a wall. Borís passed them twice and each time turned away. Berg and his wife, who were not dancing, came up to them. This family gathering seemed humiliating to Natásha, as if there were nowhere else for the family to talk but here at the ball. She did not listen to or look at Véra, who was telling her something about her own green dress. At last the Emperor stopped beside his last partner. He had danced with 3, and the music ceased. A worried aide-de-camp ran up to the Rostóvs, requesting them to stand farther back, though, as it was, they were already close to the wall, and from the gallery resounded the distinct, precise, enticingly rhythmical strains of a waltz. The Emperor looked smilingly down the room. A minute passed, but no one had yet begun dancing. An aide-de-camp, the master of ceremonies, went up to Countess Bezúkhova and asked her to dance. She smilingly raised her hand and laid it on his shoulder without looking at him. The aide-de-camp, an adept in his art, grasping his partner firmly round her waist, with confident deliberation started smoothly gliding first round the edge of the circle, then at the corner of the room he caught Helen's left hand and turned her, the only sound audible, apart from the ever-quickening music, being the rhythmic click of the spurs on his rapid, agile feet, while at every third beat his partner's velvet dress spread out and seemed to flash as she whirled round. Natásha gazed at them and was ready to cry, because it was not she who was dancing that first turn of the waltz. Prince Andrew, in the white uniform of a cavalry colonel, wearing stockings and dancing shoes, stood looking animated and bright in the front row of the circle, not far from the Rostóvs. Baron Firhoff was talking to him about the first sitting of the Council of State to be held next day. Prince Andrew, as one closely connected with Speransky and participating in the work of the Legislative Commission, could give reliable information about that sitting, concerning which various rumors were current. But not listening to what Firhoff was saying, he was gazing now at the sovereign and now at the man intending to dance, who had not yet gathered courage to enter the circle. Prince Andrew was watching these men abashed by the Emperor's presence and the women who were breathlessly longing to be asked to dance. Pierre came up to him and caught him by the arm. "You always dance. I have a protégée, the young Rostova. Here, ask her," he said. "Where is she?" asked Bolkónski. "Excuse me," he added, turning to the baron, "we will finish this conversation elsewhere. At a ball one must dance." He stepped forward in the direction Pierre indicated. The despairing, dejected expression of Natásha's face caught his eye. He recognized her, guessed her feelings, saw that it was her debut, remembered her conversation at the window, and with an expression of pleasure on his face approached Countess Rostova. "Allow me to introduce you to my daughter," said the countess with heightened color. "I have the pleasure of being already acquainted, if the countess remembers me," said Prince Andrew with a low and courteous bow, quite belying Perónskaya's remarks about his rudeness, and approaching Natásha he held out his arm to grasp her waist before he had completed his invitation. He asked her to waltz. That tremulous expression on Natásha's face, prepared either for despair or rapture, suddenly brightened into a happy, grateful, childlike smile. "I have long been waiting for you," that frightened, happy little girl seemed to say by the smile that replaced the threatened tears, as she raised her hand to Prince Andrew's shoulder. They were the second couple to enter the circle. Prince Andrew was one of the best dancers of his day, and Natásha danced exquisitely. Her little feet in their white satin dancing shoes did their work swiftly, lightly, and independently of herself, while her face beamed with ecstatic happiness. Her slender bare arms and neck were not beautiful compared to Hélène's. Her shoulders looked thin and her bosom undeveloped. But Hélène seemed, as it were, hardened by a varnish left by the thousands of looks that had scanned her person, while Natásha was like a girl exposed for the first time, who would have felt very much ashamed had she not been assured that this was absolutely necessary. Prince Andrew liked dancing, and wishing to escape as quickly as possible from the political and clever talk which everyone addressed to him, wishing also to break up the circle of restraint he disliked caused by the Emperor's presence, he danced and had chosen Natásha because Pierre pointed her out to him, and because she was the first pretty girl who caught his eye. But scarcely had he embraced that slender, supple figure and felt her steering so close to him and smiling so near him, then the wine of her charm rose to his head, and he felt himself revived and rejuvenated when, after leaving her, he stood breathing deeply and watching the other dancers. End of chapter 16. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida. War and Peace, Book 6, Chapter 17. Read for LibriVox.org by Eva Harnick. After Prince Andrew, Borís came up to ask Natásha for dance, and then the aide-de-camp, who had opened the ball, and several other young men, so that, flushed and happy, and passing on her superfluous partners to Sónya, she did not cease dancing all the evening. She noticed and saw nothing of what occupied everyone else. Not only did she fail to notice that the Emperor talked a long time with the French ambassador, and how particularly gracious he was to a certain lady, or that Prince so-and-so and so-and-so did and said this and that, and that Hélène had great success and was honored by the special attention of so-and-so. But she did not even see the Emperor, and only noticed that he had gone because the ball became livelier after his departure. For one of the merry cotillions before supper, Prince Andrew was again her partner. He reminded her of their first encounter in the Otradno Avenue, and how she had been unable to sleep that moonlight night, and told her how he had involuntarily overheard her. Natásha blushed at that recollection and tried to excuse herself, as if there had been something to be ashamed of in what Prince Andrew had overheard. Like all men who have grown up in society, Prince Andrew liked meeting someone there, not of the conventional society stamp. And such was Natásha, with her surprise, her delight, her shyness, and even her mistakes in speaking French. With her he behaved with special care and tenderness, sitting beside her and talking of the simplest and most unimportant matters. He admired her shy grace. In the middle of the cotillion, having completed one of the figures, Natásha, still out of breath, was returning to her seat when another dancer chose her. She was tired and panting, and evidently thought of declining, but immediately put her hand gaily on the man's shoulder, smiling at Prince Andrew. "I would be glad to sit beside you and rest. I am tired. But you see how they keep asking me, and I'm glad of it. I am happy, and I love everybody, and you and I understand it all." And much, much more was said in her smile. When her partner left her, Natásha ran across the room to choose 2 ladies for the figure. "If she goes to her cousin first, and then to another lady, she will be my wife," said Prince Andrew to himself, quite to his own surprise, as he watched her. She did go first to her cousin. "What rubbish sometimes enters one's head," thought Prince Andrew. "But what is certain is that that girl is so charming, so original, that she won't be dancing here a month before she will be married. Such as she are rare here," he thought, as Natásha, readjusting a rose that was slipping on her bodice, settled herself beside him. When the cotillion was over, the old count in his blue coat came up to the dancers. He invited Prince Andrew to come and see them, and asked his daughter whether she was enjoying herself. Natásha didn't answer at once, but only looked up with a smile that said reproachfully, "How can you ask such a question?" "I have never enjoyed myself so much before," she said, and Prince Andrew noticed how her thin arms rose quickly as if to embrace her father, and instantly dropped again. Natásha was happier than she had ever been in her life. She was at that height of bliss when one becomes completely kind and good, and does not believe in the possibility of evil, unhappiness, or sorrow. At that ball Pierre for the first time felt humiliated by the position his wife occupied in court circles. He was gloomy and absent-minded. A deep furrow ran across his forehead, and standing by a window he stared over his spectacles, seeing no one. On her way to supper, Natásha passed him. Pierre's gloomy, unhappy look struck her. She stopped in front of him. She wished to help him, to bestow on him the superabundance of her own happiness. "How delightful it is, Count," said she, "isn't it?" Pierre smiled absent-mindedly, evidently not grasping what she said. "Yes, I'm very glad," he said. "How can people be dissatisfied with anything?" thought Natásha. "Especially such a capital fellow as Bezúkhov." In Natásha's eyes all the people at the ball alike were good, kind, and splendid people, loving one another, none of them capable of injuring another, and so they ought all to be happy. End of chapter 17. Recording by Eva Harnik, Ponte Vedra, Florida. War and Peace, Book 6, Chapter 18, read for LibriVox.org by Eva Harnik. Next day Prince Andrew thought of the ball, but his mind did not dwell on it long. Yes, it was a very brilliant ball. And then, yes, that little Rostova is very charming. There is something fresh, original, un-Petersburg-like about her that distinguishes her. That was all he thought about yesterday's ball, and after his morning tea he set to work. But either from fatigue or want of sleep he was ill-disposed for work and could get nothing done. He kept criticizing his own work, as he often did, and was glad when he heard someone coming. The visitor was Bitsky, who served on various committees, frequented all the societies in Petersburg, and a passionate devotee of the new ideas and of Speransky, and a diligent Petersburg newsmonger, one of those men who choose their opinions like their clothes according to the fashion, but who for that very reason appeared to be the warmest partisans. Hardly had he got rid of his hat before he ran into Prince Andrew's room with a preoccupied air and at once began talking. He had just heard particulars of that morning's sitting of the Council of State opened by the Emperor, and he spoke of it enthusiastically. The Emperor's speech had been extraordinary. It had been a speech such as only constitutional monarchs deliver. The sovereign plainly said that the Council and Senate are estates of the realm. He said that the government must rest not on authority, but on secure basis. The Emperor said that the fiscal system must be reorganized and the accounts published, recounted Bitsky, emphasizing certain words and opening his eyes significantly. Ah, yes, today's events mark an epoch, the greatest epoch in our history, he concluded. Prince Andrew listened to the account of the opening of the Council of State, which he had so impatiently awaited, and to which he had attached such importance, and was surprised that this event, now that it had taken place, did not affect him, and even seemed quite insignificant. He listened with quiet irony to Bitsky's enthusiastic account of it. A very simple thought occurred to him. What does it matter to me or to Bitsky what the Emperor was pleased to say at the council? Can all that make me any happier or better? And this simple reflection suddenly destroyed all the interest Prince Andrew had felt in the impending reforms. He was going to dine that evening at Speransky's with only a few friends, as the host had said when inviting him. The prospect of that dinner in the intimate home circle of the man he so admired had greatly interested Prince Andrew, especially as he had not yet seen Speransky in his domestic surroundings. But now he felt disinclined to go to it. At the appointed hour, however, he entered the modest house Speransky owned in the Taurida Gardens. In the parqueted dining-room, this small house, remarkable for its extreme cleanliness, suggesting that of a monastery, Prince Andrew, who was rather late, found the friendly gathering of Speransky's intimate acquaintances already assembled at 5 o'clock. There were no ladies present, except Speransky's little daughter, long-faced like her father, and her governess. The other guests were Gervais, Magnitsky, and Stolzypin. While still in the anteroom, Prince Andrew heard loud voices and a ringing staccato laugh, a laugh such as one hears on the stage. Someone, it sounded like Speransky, was distinctly ejaculating, "Ha, ha, ha!" Prince Andrew had never before heard Speransky's famous laugh, and this ringing, high-pitched laughter from a statesman made a strange impression on him. He entered the dining-room. The whole company was standing between two windows at a small table laid with hors d'oeuvres. Speransky, wearing a grey swallowtail coat with a star on the breast, and evidently still the same waistcoat and high white stock he had worn at the meeting of the Council of State, stood at the table with a beaming countenance. His guests surrounding him, Magnitsky, addressing himself to Speransky, was relating an anecdote, and Speransky was laughing in advance at what Magnitsky was going to say. When Prince Andrew entered the room, Magnitsky's words were again crowned by laughter. Stolipin gave a deep bass guffaw as he munched a piece of bread and cheese. Gervais laughed softly with a hissing chuckle, and Speransky in a high-pitched staccato manner. Still laughing, Speransky held out his soft white hand to Prince Andrew. "Very pleased to see you, Prince," he said. "One moment," he went on, turning to Magnitsky and interrupting his story. "We have agreed that this is a dinner for recreation, with not a word about business." And, turning again to the narrator, he began to laugh afresh. Prince Andrew looked at the laughing Speransky with astonishment, regret, and disillusionment. It seemed to him that this was not Speransky, but someone else. Everything that had formerly appeared mysterious and fascinating in Speransky suddenly became plain and unattractive. At dinner the conversation did not cease for a moment and seemed to consist of the contents of a book of funny anecdotes. Before Magnitsky had finished his story, someone else was anxious to relate something still funnier. Most of the anecdotes, if not relating to the state service, related to people in the service. It seemed that in this company the insignificance of those people was so definitely accepted that the only possible attitude toward them was one of good-humored ridicule. Speransky related how at the council that morning a deaf dignitary, when asked his opinion, replied that he thought so too. Gervais gave a long account of an official revision, remarkable for the stupidity of everybody concerned. Stolipin, stuttering, broke into the conversation and began excitedly talking of the abuses that existed under the former order of things, threatening to give a serious turn to the conversation. Magnitsky starting quizzing Stolipin about his vehemence. Gervais intervened with a joke, and the talk reverted to its former lively tone. Evidently Speransky liked to rest after his labors and find amusement in a circle of friends, and his guests, understanding his wish, tried to enliven him and amuse themselves. But their gaiety seemed to Prince Andrew mirthless and tiresome. Speransky's high-pitched voice struck him unpleasantly, and the incessant laughter grated on him like a false note. Prince Andrew did not laugh and feared that he would be a damper on the spirits of the company, but no one took any notice of his being out of harmony with the general mood. They all seemed very gay. He tried several times to join in the conversation, but his remarks were tossed aside each time like a cork thrown out of the water, and he could not jest with them. There was nothing wrong or unseemly in what they said. It was witty and might have been funny, but it lacked just that something which is the salt of mirth, and they were not even aware that such a thing existed. After dinner, Speransky's daughter and her governess rose. He patted the little girl with his white hand and kissed her, and that gesture too seemed unnatural to Prince Andrew. The man remained at table, over their port English fashion. In the midst of a conversation that was started about Napoleon's Spanish affairs, which they all agreed in approving, Prince Andrew began to express a contrary opinion. Speransky smiled and, with an evident wish to prevent the conversation from taking an unpleasant course, told a story that had no connection with the previous conversation. For a few moments all were silent. Having sat some time at table, Speransky corked a bottle of wine and, remarking, "Nowadays good wine rides in a carriage and pair," passed it to the servant and got up. All rose and, continuing to talk loudly, went into the drawing-room. 2 letters brought by a courier were handed to Speransky, and he took them to his study. As soon as he had left the room, the general merriment stopped, and the guests began to converse sensibly and quietly with one another. "Now for the recitation," said Speransky on returning from his study. "A wonderful talent," he said to Prince Andrew, and Magnitsky immediately assumed a pose and began reciting some humorous verses in French which he had composed about various well-known Petersburg people. He was interrupted several times by applause. When the verses were finished, Prince Andrew went up to Speransky and took his leave. "Where are you off to so early?" asked Speransky. "I promised to go to a reception." They said no more. Prince Andrew looked closely into those mirror-like, impenetrable eyes and felt that it had been ridiculous of him to have expected anything from Speransky and from any of his own activities connected with him, or ever to have attributed importance to what Speransky was doing. That precise, mirthless laughter rang in Prince Andrew's ears long after he had left the house. When he reached home, Prince Andrew began thinking of his life in Petersburg during those last 4 months as if it were something new. He recalled his exertions and solicitations, and the history of his project of army reform, which had been accepted for consideration and which they were trying to pass over in silence simply because another, a very poor one, had already been prepared and submitted to the Emperor. He thought of the meetings of a committee of which Berg was a member. He remembered how carefully and at what length everything relating to form and procedure was discussed at those meetings, and how sedulously and promptly all that related to the gist of the business was evaded. He recalled his labors on the legal code, and how painstakingly he had translated the articles of the Roman and French codes into Russian, and he felt ashamed of himself. Then he vividly pictured to himself Bogucharovo, his occupations in the country, his journey to Ryazan. He remembered the peasants and Dron, the village elder, and mentally applying to them the personal rights he had divided into paragraphs, he felt astonished that he could have spent so much time on such useless work. End of chapter 19. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida.
Peace, Book 6, Chapter 19, read for LibriVox.org by Wet Coast. Next day, Prince Andrew called at a few houses he had not visited before, and among them at the Rostovs, with whom he had renewed acquaintance at the ball. Apart from considerations of politeness which demanded the call, he wanted to see that original, eager girl who had left such a pleasant impression on his mind in her own home. Natásha was one of the first to meet him. She was wearing a dark blue house dress, in which Prince Andrew thought her even prettier than in her ball dress. She and all the Rostov family welcomed him as an old friend, simply and cordially. The whole family, whom he had formerly judged severely, now seemed to him to consist of excellent, simple, and kindly people. The old count's hospitality and good nature, which struck one especially in Petersburg as a pleasant surprise, were such that Prince Andrew could not refuse to stay to dinner. Yes, he thought, they are capital people, who of course have not the slightest idea what a treasure they possess in Natásha, but they are kindly folk, and form the best possible setting for this strikingly poetic, charming girl overflowing with life. In Natásha, Prince Andrew was conscious of a strange world completely alien to him, and brimful of joys unknown to him, a different world, that in the Audrino Avenue and at the window that moonlight night had already begun to disconcert him. Now this world disconcerted him no longer, and was no longer alien to him, but he himself, having entered it, found in it a new enjoyment. As soon as Natásha had finished, she went up to him and asked how he liked her voice. She asked this and then became confused, feeling that she ought not to have asked it. He smiled, looking at her, and said he liked her singing as he liked everything she did. Prince Andrew left the Rostovs late in the evening. He went to bed from habit, but soon realized that he could not sleep. Having lit his candle, he sat up in bed, then got up, then lay down again, not at all troubled by his sleeplessness. His soul was as fresh and joyful as if he had stepped out of a stuffy room into God's own fresh air. It did not enter his head that he was in love with Natásha. He was not thinking about her, but only picturing her to himself, and in consequence all life appeared in a new light. Why do I strive, why do I toil in this narrow confined frame, when life, all life with all its joys, is open to me, said he to himself. And for the first time for a very long while he began making happy plans for the future. He decided that he must attend to his son's education by finding a tutor and putting the boy in his charge. Then he ought to retire from the service and go abroad and see England, Switzerland, and Italy. I must use my freedom while I feel so much strength and youth in me, he said to himself. Pierre was right when he said one must believe in the possibility of happiness in order to be happy, and now I do believe in it. Let the dead bury their dead, but while one has life, one must live and be happy, thought he. End of chapter 19. Recording by Wet Coast, Vancouver, Canada.
War and Peace, Book 6, Chapter 20. Recorded for LibriVox.org by Eva Harnick. One morning, Colonel Berg, whom Pierre knew as he knew everybody in Moscow and Petersburg, came to see him. Berg arrived in an immaculate brand-new uniform, with his hair pomaded and brushed forward over his temples, as the Emperor Alexander wore his hair. "I have just been to see the Countess, your wife. Unfortunately, she could not grant my request, but I hope, Count, I shall be more fortunate with you," he said with a smile. "What is it you wish, Colonel? I am at your service." "I have not quite settled in my new rooms, Count." Berg said this with perfect conviction that this information could not but be agreeable, "and so I wish to arrange just a small party for my own and my wife's friends." He smiled still more pleasantly. "I wish to ask the Countess and you to do me the honor of coming to tea and to supper." Only Countess Hélène, considering the society of such people as the Bergs beneath her, could be cruel enough to refuse such an invitation. Berg explained so clearly why he wanted to collect at his house a small but select company, and why this would give him pleasure, and why, though he grudged spending money on cards or anything harmful, he was prepared to run into some expense for the sake of good society, that Pierre could not refuse and promised to come. "But don't be late, Count, if I may venture to ask. About 10 minutes to 8, please. We shall make up a rubber. Our general is coming. He is very good to me." We shall have supper, Count, so you will do me the favor." Contrary to his habit of being late, Pierre on that day arrived at the Bergs' house, not at 10 but at 15 minutes to 8. Having prepared everything necessary for the party, the Bergs were ready for their guests' arrival. In their new, clean and light study, with its small busts and pictures and new furniture, sat Berg and his wife. Berg, closely buttoned up in his new uniform, sat beside his wife, explaining to her that one always could and should be acquainted with people above one, because only then does one get satisfaction from acquaintances. You can get to know something, you can ask for something. See how I managed from my first promotion? Berg measured his life not by years but by promotions. My comrades are still nobodies, while I am only waiting for a vacancy to command a regiment and have the happiness to be your husband. He rose and kissed Véra's hand, and on the way to her straightened out a turned-up corner of the carpet. And how have I obtained all this? Chiefly by knowing how to choose my acquaintances. It goes without saying, then one must be conscientious and methodical. Berg smiled with a sense of his superiority over a weak woman and paused, reflecting that this dear wife of his was, after all, but a weak woman who could not understand all that constitutes a man's dignity, what it was ein Mann zu sein, to be a man. Véra, at the same time, smiling with a sense of superiority over her good, conscientious husband, who all the same understood life wrongly, as according to Véra all men did. Berg, judging by his wife, thought all women weak and foolish. Véra, judging only by her husband, and generalizing from that observation, supposed that all men, though they understand nothing and are conceited and selfish, ascribe common sense to themselves alone. Berg rose and embraced his wife carefully, so as not to crush her lace fichu, for which he had paid a good price, kissing her straight on the lips. "The only thing is, we mustn't have children too soon," he continued, following an unconscious sequence of ideas. "Yes," answered Véra, "I don't at all want that. We must live for society." "Princess Yusupova wore one exactly like this," said Berg, pointing to the fichu with a happy and kindly smile. Just then Count Bezúkhov was announced. Husband and wife glanced at one another, both smiling with self-satisfaction and each mentally claiming the honor of this visit. "This is what comes of knowing how to make acquaintances," thought Berg. "This is what comes of knowing how to conduct oneself." "But please don't interrupt me when I'm entertaining the guests," said Véra, "because I know what interests each of them and what to say to different people." Berg smiled again. "It can't be helped. Men must sometimes have masculine conversation," said he. They received Pierre in their small new drawing-room, where it was impossible to sit down anywhere without disturbing its symmetry, neatness, and order. So It was quite comprehensible and not strange that Berg, having generously offered to disturb the symmetry of an armchair or of the sofa for his dear guest, but being apparently painfully undecided on the matter himself, eventually left the visitor to settle the question of selection. Pierre disturbed the symmetry by moving a chair for himself, and Berg and Véra immediately began their evening party, interrupting each other in their efforts to entertain their guest. Véra, having decided in her own mind that Pierre ought to be entertained with conversation about the French embassy, at once began accordingly. Berg, having decided that masculine conversation was required, interrupted his wife's remarks and touched on the question of the war with Austria, and unconsciously jumped from the general subject to personal consideration as to the proposal made him to take part in the Austrian campaign and the reasons why he had declined them. Though the conversation was very incoherent and Véra was angry at the intrusion of the masculine element, both husband and wife felt with satisfaction that even if only one guest was present, their evening had begun very well and was as like as two peas to every other evening party, with its talk, tea, and lighted candles. Before long, Borís, Berg's old comrade, arrived. There was a shade of condescension and patronage in his treatment of Berg and Véra. After Borís came a lady with the colonel, then the general himself, then the Rostóvs, and the party became unquestionably exactly like all other evening parties. Berg and Véra could not repress their smiles of satisfaction at the sight of all this movement in their drawing-room, at the sound of the disconnected talk, the rustling of dresses, and the bowing and scraping. Everything was just as everybody always has it, especially so the general, who admired the apartment, patted Berg on the shoulder, and with parental authority superintended the setting out of the table for Boston. The general sat down by Count Ilyá Rostov, who was, next to himself, the most important guest. The old people sat with the old, the young with the young, and the hostess at the tea table, on which stood exactly the same kind of cakes in a silver cake basket as the Panins had at their party. Everything was just as it was everywhere else. End of chapter 20. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida.
War and Peace, Book 6, Chapter 21. Read for LibriVox.org by Roger Moline. Pierre, as one of the principal guests, had to sit down to Boston with Count Rostóv, the general, and the colonel. At the card table he happened to be directly facing Natásha, and was struck by a curious change that had come over her since the ball. She was silent, and not only less pretty than at the ball, but only redeemed from plainness by her look of gentle indifference to everything around. "What's the matter with her?" thought Pierre, glancing at her. She was sitting by her sister at the tea table and reluctantly, without looking at him, made some reply to Borís, who sat down beside her. After playing out a whole suit and, to his partner's delight, taking 5 tricks, Pierre, hearing greetings and the steps of someone who had entered the room while he was picking up his tricks, glanced again at Natásha. "What has happened to her?" he asked himself with still greater surprise. Prince Andrew was standing before her, saying something to her with a look of tender solicitude. She, having raised her head, was looking up at him, flushed and evidently trying to master her rapid breathing. and the bright glow of some inner fire that had been suppressed was again alight in her. She was completely transformed, and from a plain girl had again become what she had been at the ball. Prince Andrew went up to Pierre, and the latter noticed a new and youthful expression in his friend's face. Pierre changed places several times during the game, sitting now with his back to Natásha and now facing her, but during the whole of the 6 rubbers he watched her and his friend. "Something very important is happening between them," thought Pierre, and a feeling that was both joyful and painful agitated him and made him neglect the game. After 6 rubbers the general got up, saying that it was no use playing like that, and Pierre was released. Natásha on one side was talking with Sónya and Borís, and Véra with a subtle smile was saying something to Prince Andrew. Pierre went up to his friend and, asking whether they were talking secrets, sat down beside them. Véra, having noticed Prince Andrew's attentions to Natásha, decided that at a party, a real evening party, subtle allusions to the tender passion were absolutely necessary, and seizing a moment when Prince Andrew was alone, began a conversation with him about feelings in general and about her sister. With so intellectual a guest as she considered Prince Andrew to be, she felt that she had to employ her diplomatic tact. When Pierre went up to them he noticed that Véra was being carried away by her self-satisfied talk, but that Prince Andrew seemed embarrassed, a thing that rarely happened with him. "What do you think?" Véra was saying with an arch smile. "You are so discerning, Prince, and understand people's characters so well at a glance. What do you think of Natalie? Could she be constant in her attachments? Could she, like other women," Véra meant herself, "love a man once for all and remain true to him forever? That is what I consider true love. What do you think, Prince?" "I know your sister too little," replied Prince Andrew with a sarcastic smile under which he wished to hide his embarrassment, "to be able to solve so delicate a question, and then I have noticed that the less attractive a woman is, the more constant she is likely to be," he added, and looked up at Pierre who was just approaching them. "Yes, that is true, Prince. In our days," continued Véra, mentioning "our days" as people of limited intelligence are fond of doing, imagining that they have discovered and appraised the peculiarities of "our days," and that human characteristics change with the times. "In our days a girl has so much freedom that the pleasure of being courted often stifles real feeling in her. And it must be confessed that Natalie is very susceptible." This return to the subject of Natalie caused Prince Andrew to knit his brows with discomfort. He was about to rise, but Véra continued with a still more subtle smile. "I think no one has been more courted than she," she went on. "But till quite lately she never cared seriously for anyone. Now you know, Count," she said to Pierre, "even our dear cousin Borís, who, between ourselves, was very far gone in the land of tenderness," alluding to a map of love much in vogue at that time. Prince Andrew frowned and remained silent. "You are friendly with Borís, aren't you?" asked Véra. "Yes, I know him." "I expect he has told you of his childish love for Natásha?" "Oh, there was childish love?" suddenly asked Prince Andrew, blushing unexpectedly. "Yes, you know between cousins intimacy often leads to love. Le cousinage est un dangereux voisinage. Don't you think so?" "Oh, undoubtedly," said Prince Andrew, and with a sudden and unnatural liveliness he began chaffing Pierre about the need to be very careful with his 50-year-old Moscow cousins, and in the midst of these jesting remarks he rose, taking Pierre by the arm, and drew him aside. "Well?" asked Pierre, seeing his friend's strange animation with surprise, and noticing the glance he turned on Natásha as he rose. I must have a talk with you," said Prince Andrew. "You know that pair of woman's gloves?" He referred to the Masonic gloves given to a newly initiated brother to present to the woman he loved. But no, I will talk to you later on." And with a strange light in his eyes and restlessness in his movements, Prince Andrew approached Natásha and sat down beside her. Pierre saw how Prince Andrew asked her something and how she flushed as she replied. But at that moment Berg came in to Pierre and began insisting that he should take part in an argument between the general and the colonel on the affairs in Spain. Berg was satisfied and happy. The smile of pleasure never left his face. The party was very successful and quite like other parties he had seen. Everything was similar: the ladies' subtle talk, the cards, the general raising his voice at the card table, and the samovar and the tea cakes. Only one thing was lacking that he had always seen at the evening parties he wished to imitate. They had not yet had a loud conversation among the men and a dispute about something important and clever. Now the general had begun such a discussion, and so Berg drew Pierre to it. End of chapter 21. Recording by Roger Moline. War and Peace, Book 6, Chapter 22. Read for LibriVox.org by Roger Moline. Next day, having been invited by the count, Prince Andrew dined with the Rostóvs and spent the rest of the day there. Everyone in the house realized for whose sake Prince Andrew came, and without concealing it he tried to be with Natásha all day. Not only in the soul of the frightened yet happy and enraptured Natásha, but in the whole house, there was a feeling of awe at something important that was bound to happen. The countess looked with sad and sternly serious eyes at Prince Andrew when he talked to Natásha, and timidly started some artificial conversation about trifles as soon as he looked her way. Sónya was afraid to leave Natásha, and afraid of being in the way when she was with them. Natásha grew pale, in a panic of expectation, when she remained alone with him for a moment. Prince Andrew surprised her by his timidity. She felt that he wanted to say something to her, but could not bring himself to do so. In the evening, when Prince Andrew had left, the countess went up to Natásha and whispered, "Well, what?" "Mamma, for heaven's sake, don't ask me anything now. One can't talk about that," said Natásha. But all the same, that night Natásha, now agitated and now frightened, lay a long time in her mother's bed, gazing straight before her. She told her how he had complimented her, how he told her he was going abroad, asked her where they were going to spend the summer, and how he had asked her about Borís. "But such a never happened to me before," she said. "Only I feel afraid in his presence. I am always afraid when I'm with him. What does that mean? Does it mean that it's the real thing? Yes? Mamma, are you asleep?" "No, my love, I am frightened myself," answered her mother. "Now go." "All the same, I shan't sleep. What silliness to sleep! Mummy, Mummy, such a thing has never happened to me before," she said, surprised and alarmed at the feeling she was aware of in herself. "And could we ever have thought?" It seemed to Natásha that even at the time she first saw Prince Andrew at Otrádnoe she had fallen in love with him. It was as if she feared this strange, unexpected happiness of meeting again the very man she had then chosen (she was firmly convinced she had done so), and of finding him, as it seemed, not indifferent to her. "And it had to happen that he should come specially to Petersburg while we are here. And it had to happen that we should meet at that ball. It is fate, clearly it is fate that everything led up to this. Already then, directly I saw him, I felt something peculiar." "What else did he say to you? What are those verses? Read them," said her mother thoughtfully, referring to some verses Prince Andrew had written in Natásha's album. "Mamma, one need not be ashamed of his being a widower." "Don't, Natásha. Pray to God, marriages are made in heaven," said her mother. "Darling Mummy, how I love you! How happy I am!" cried Natásha, shedding tears of joy and excitement and embracing her mother. At that very time Prince Andrew was sitting with Pierre and telling him of his love for Natásha and his firm resolve to make her his wife. That day Countess Hélène had a reception at her house. The French ambassador was there, and a foreign prince of the blood who had of late become a frequent visitor of hers, and many brilliant ladies and gentlemen. Pierre, who had come downstairs, walked through the rooms and struck everyone by his preoccupied, absent-minded, and morose air. Since the ball he had felt the approach of a fit of nervous depression and had made desperate efforts to combat it. Since the intimacy of his wife with the royal prince, Pierre had unexpectedly been made a gentleman of the bedchamber, and from that time he had begun to feel oppressed and ashamed in court society, and dark thoughts of the vanity of all things human came to him oftener than before. At the same time the feeling he had noticed between his protégée Natásha and Prince Andrew accentuated his gloom by the contrast between his own position and his friend's. He tried equally to avoid thinking about his wife and about Natásha and Prince Andrew, and again everything seemed to him insignificant in comparison with eternity. Again the question, "For what?" presented itself, and he forced himself to work day and night at Masonic labors, hoping to drive away the evil spirit that threatened him. Toward midnight, after he had left the countess's apartments, he was sitting upstairs in a shabby dressing gown, copying out the original transaction of the Scottish Lodge of Freemasons at a table in his low room cloudy with tobacco smoke, when someone came in. It was Prince Andrew. "Ah, it's you," said Pierre with a preoccupied, dissatisfied air. "And I, you see, am hard at it." He pointed to his manuscript book with that air of escaping from the ills of life with which unhappy people look at their work. Prince Andrew, with a beaming, ecstatic expression of renewed life on his face, paused in front of Pierre and, not noticing his sad look, smiled at him with the egotism of joy. "Well, dear heart," said he, "I wanted to tell you about it yesterday, and I have come to do so today. I never experienced anything like it before. I am in love, my friend." Suddenly Pierre heaved a deep sigh and dumped his heavy person down on the sofa beside Prince Andrew. "With Natásha Rostova, yes?" said he. "Yes, yes. Who else should it be? I should never have believed it, but the feeling is stronger than I. Yesterday I tormented myself and suffered, but I would not exchange even that torment for anything in the world. I have not lived till now. At last I live, but I can't live without her. But can she love me? I am too old for her. Why don't you speak?" "I? What did I tell you?" said Pierre suddenly, rising and beginning to pace up and down the room. "I always thought it... That girl is such a treasure. She is a rare girl. My dear friend, I entreat you, don't philosophize, don't doubt. Marry, 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 and I am sure there will not be a happier man than you." "But what of her?" "She loves you." "Don't talk rubbish," said Prince Andrew, smiling and looking into Pierre's eyes. "She does, I know," Pierre cried fiercely. "But do listen," returned Prince Andrew, holding him by the arm. "Do you know the condition I am in? I must talk about it to someone." "Well, go on, go on. I am very glad," said Pierre, and his face really changed. His brow became smooth, and he listened gladly to Prince Andrew. Prince Andrew seemed, and really was, quite a different, quite a new man. Where was his spleen, his contempt for life, his disillusionment? Pierre was the only person to whom he made up his mind to speak openly, and to him he told all that was in his soul. Now he boldly and lightly made plans for an extended future, said he could not sacrifice his own happiness to his father's caprice, and spoke of how he would either make his father consent to this marriage and love her, or would do without his consent. Then he marveled at the feeling that had mastered him as at something strange, apart from and independent of himself. "I should not have believed anyone who told me that I was capable of such love," said Prince Andrew. "It is not at all the same feeling that I knew in the past. This whole world is now for me divided into two halves. One half is she, and there all is joy, hope, light. The other half is everything where she is not, and there is all gloom and darkness." "Darkness and gloom," reiterated Pierre. "Yes, yes, I understand that." "I cannot help loving the light. It is not my fault, and I am very happy. You understand me? I know you are glad for my sake." "Yes, yes," Pierre assented, looking at his friend with a touched and sad expression in his eyes. The brighter Prince Andrew's lot appeared to him, the gloomier seemed his own. End of chapter 22. Recording by Roger Moline.
War and Peace, Book 6, Chapter 23. Read for LibriVox.org by Eva Harnick. Prince Andrew needed his father's consent to his marriage, and to obtain this he started for the country next day. His father received his son's communication with external composure but inward wrath. He could not comprehend how anyone could wish to alter his life or introduce anything new into it, when his own life was already ending. "If only they would let me end my days as I want to," thought the old man, "then they might do as they please." With his son, however, he employed the diplomacy he reserved for important occasions, and, adopting a quiet tone, discussed the whole matter. In the first place, the marriage was not a brilliant one as regards birth, wealth, or rank. Secondly, Prince Andrew was no longer as young as he had been, and his health was poor. The old man laid special stress on this, while she was very young. Thirdly, he had a son whom it would be a pity to entrust to a chit of a girl. Fourthly, and finally, the father said, looking ironically at his son, "I beg you to put it off for a year. Go abroad, take a cure, look out as you wanted to for a German tutor for Prince Nicholas. Then, if your love or passion or obstinacy, as you please, is still as great, marry. And that is my last word on it. Mind, the last," concluded the prince in a tone which showed that nothing would make him alter his decision. Prince Andrew saw clearly that the old man hoped that his feelings or his fiancée's would not stand a year's test, or that he, the old prince himself, would die before then, and he decided to conform to his father's wish to propose and postpone the wedding for a year. 3 weeks after the last evening he had spent with the Rostóvs, Prince Andrew returned to Petersburg. Next day, after her talk with her mother, Natásha expected Bolkónski all day, but he did not come. On the second and third day it was the same. Pierre did not come either, and Natásha, not knowing that Prince Andrew had gone to see his father, could not explain his absence to herself. 3 weeks passed in this way. Natásha had no desire to go out anywhere, and wandered from room to room like a shadow, idle and listless. She wept secretly at night, and did not go to her mother in the evenings. She blushed continually and was irritable. It seemed to her that everybody knew about her disappointment and was laughing at her and pitying her. Strong as was her inward grief, this wound to her vanity intensified her misery. Once she came to her mother, tried to say something, and suddenly began to cry. Her tears were those of an offended child who does not know why it is being punished. The countess began to soothe Natásha, who, after first listening to her mother's words, suddenly interrupted her. "Leave off, Mamma. I don't want to think about it. He just came and then left off. Left off!" Her voice trembled, and she again nearly cried, but recovered and went on quietly. "And I don't at all want to get married, and I am afraid of him. I have now become quite calm, quite calm." The day after this conversation, Natásha put on the old dress which she knew had the peculiar property of conducing to cheerfulness in the mornings, and that day she returned to the old way of life which she had abandoned since the ball. Having finished her morning tea, she went to the ballroom, which she particularly liked for its loud resonance, and began singing her solfeggio. When she had finished her first exercise, she stood still in the middle of the room and sang a musical phrase that particularly pleased her. She listened joyfully, as though she had not expected it, to the charm of the notes reverberating, filling the whole empty ballroom, and slowly dying away. And all at once she felt cheerful. "What is the good of making so much of it? Things are nice as it is," she said to herself, and she began walking up and down the room, not stepping simply on the resounding parquet, but treading with each step from the heel to the toe (she had on a new and favorite pair of shoes), and listening to the regular tap of the heel and the creak of the toe as gladly as she had to the sounds of her own voice. Passing a mirror, she glanced into it. "There, that is me," the expression of her face seemed to say as she caught sight of herself. "Well, and very nice too. I need nobody." A footman wanted to come in to clear away something in the room, but she would not let him, and having closed the door behind him, continued her walk. That morning she had returned to her favorite mood, love of and delight in herself. "How charming that Natásha is!" she said again, speaking as some third collective male person. "Pretty, a good voice, young, and in nobody's way, if only they leave her in peace." But however much they left her in peace, she could not now be at peace, and immediately felt this. In the hall the porch door opened and someone asked, "At home?" and then footsteps were heard. Natásha was looking at the mirror, but did not see herself. She listened to the sounds in the hall. When she saw herself, her face was pale. It was he. She knew this for certain. though she hardly heard his voice through the closed doors. Pale and agitated, Natásha ran into the drawing-room. "Mamma! Bolkónski has come!" she said. "Mamma! It is awful! It is unbearable! I don't want to be tormented. What am I to do?" Before the countess could answer, Prince Andrew entered the room with an agitated and serious face. As soon as he saw Natásha, his face brightened. He kissed the countess's hand and Natásha's and sat down beside the sofa. "It is long since we had the pleasure..." began the countess, but Prince Andrew interrupted her by answering her intended question, obviously in haste to say what he had to. "I have not been to see all this time, because I have been at my father's. I had to talk over a very important matter with him. I only got back last night," he said, glancing at Natásha. "I want to have a talk with you, Countess," he added after a moment's pause. The countess lowered her eyes, sighing deeply. "I am at your disposal," she murmured. Natásha knew that she ought to go away, but was unable to do so. Something gripped her throat, and regardless of manners, she stared straight at Prince Andrew with wide open eyes. "At once? This instant? No, it can't be," she thought. Again he glanced at her, and that glance convinced her that she was not mistaken. Yes, at once, that very instant her fate would be decided. "Go, Natásha, I will call you," said the countess in a whisper. Natásha glanced with frightened, imploring eyes at Prince Andrew and at her mother and went out. "I have come, Countess, to ask for your daughter's hand," said Prince Andrew. The countess's face flushed hotly, but she said nothing. "Your offer..." she began at last sedately. He remained silent, looking into her eyes. "Your offer..." she grew confused, "is agreeable to us, and I accept your offer. I am glad. And my husband..." "I hope. But it will depend on her." "I will speak to her when I have your consent. Do you give it to me?" said Prince Andrew. "Yes," replied the countess. She held out her hand to him, and with a mixed feeling of estrangement and tenderness pressed her lips to his forehead as he stooped to kiss her hand. She wished to love him as a son, but felt that to her he was a stranger and a terrifying man. "I am sure my husband will consent," said the countess, "but your father..." "My father, to whom I have told my plans, has made it an express condition of his consent that the wedding is not to take place for a year. And I wish to tell you of that," said Prince Andrew. "It is true that Natásha is still young, but so long as that..." "It is unavoidable," said Prince Andrew with a sigh. "I will send her to you," said the countess, and left the room. "Lord, have mercy upon us!" she repeated while seeking her daughter. Sónya said that Natásha was in her bedroom. Natásha was sitting on the bed, pale and dry-eyed, and was gazing at the icons and whispering something as she rapidly crossed herself. Seeing her mother, she jumped up and flew to her. "Well, Mamma? Well?" Go to him. He is asking for your hand," said the countess, coldly it seemed to Natásha. Go, said the mother sadly and reproachfully with a deep sigh as her daughter ran away. Natásha never remembered how she entered the drawing-room. When she came in and saw him, she paused. "Is it possible that this stranger has now become everything to me?" she asked herself, and immediately answered, "Yes, everything. He alone is now dearer to me than everything in the world." Prince Andrew came up to her with downcast eyes. "I have loved you from the very first moment I saw you. May I hope?" He looked at her and was struck by the serious, impassioned expression of her face. Her face said, "Why ask? Why doubt what you cannot but know? Why speak when words cannot express what one feels?" She drew near to him and stopped. He took her hand and kissed it. "Do you love me?" "Yes, yes," Natásha murmured, as if in vexation. Then she sighed loudly and, catching her breath more and more quickly, began to sob. "What is it? What is the matter?" "Oh, I am so happy!" she replied, smiled through her tears, bent over closer to him, paused for an instant as if asking herself whether she might, and then kissed him. Prince Andrew held her hands, looked into her eyes, and did not find in his heart his former love for her. Something in him had suddenly changed. There was no longer the former poetic and mystic charm of desire, but there was pity for her feminine and childish weakness, fear at her devotion and trustfulness, and an oppressive yet joyful sense of the duty that now bound him to her forever. The present feeling, though not so bright and poetic as the former, was stronger and more serious. "Did your mother tell you that it cannot be for a year?" asked Prince Andrew, still looking into her eyes. "Is it possible that I, the chit of a girl as everybody called me," thought Natásha, "is it possible that I am now to be the wife and the equal of this strange, dear, clever man whom even my father looks up to? Can it be true? Can it be true that there can be no more playing with life, that now I am grown up, that on me now lies a responsibility for my every word and deed? Yes, but what did he ask me?" "No," she replied, but she had not understood his question. "Forgive me," he said, "but you are so young, and I have already been through so much in life. I am afraid for you. You do not yet know yourself." Natásha listened with concentrated attention, trying but failing to take in the meaning of his words. "Hard as this year, which delays my happiness, will be," continued Prince Andrew, "it will give you time to be sure of yourself. I ask you to make me happy in a year, but you are free. Our engagement shall remain a secret, and should you find that you do not love me, or should you come to love..." said Prince Andrew with an unnatural smile. "Why do you say that?" Natásha interrupted him. "You know that from the very day you first came to Otrádnoe I have loved you," she cried, quite convinced that she spoke the truth. "In a year you will learn to know yourself." "A whole year!" Natásha repeated suddenly, only now realizing that the marriage was to be postponed for a year. "But why a year? Why a year?" Prince Andrew began to explain to her the reasons for this delay. Natásha did not hear him. "And can't it be helped?" she asked. Prince Andrew did not reply, but his face expressed the impossibility of altering that decision. "It is awful! Oh, it is awful, awful!" Natásha suddenly cried and again burst into sobs. "I shall die waiting a year. It is impossible, it is awful!" She looked into her lover's face and saw in it a look of commiseration and perplexity. "No, no, I will do anything," she said, suddenly checking her tears. "I am so happy." The father and mother came into the room and gave the betrothed couple their blessing. From that day Prince Andrew began to frequent the Rostóvs as Natásha's affianced lover. End of chapter 23. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida.
Book 6, Chapter 24, read for LibriVox.org by Wetcoast. No betrothal ceremony took place, and Natásha's engagement to Bolkónski was not announced. Prince Andrew insisted on that. He said that, as he was responsible for the delay, he ought to bear the whole burden of it, that he had given his word and bound himself forever, but that he did not wish to bind Natásha and gave her perfect freedom. If, after 6 months, she felt that she did not love him, she would have full right to reject him. Naturally, neither Natásha nor her parents wished to hear of this, but Prince Andrew was firm. He came every day to the Rostóvs, but did not behave to Natásha as an affianced lover. He did not use the familiar thou, but said you to her, and kissed only her hand. After their engagement, quite different, intimate, and natural relations sprang up between them. It was as if they had not known each other till now. Both liked to recall how they had regarded each other when as yet they were nothing to one another. They felt themselves now quite different beings. Then they were artificial, now natural and sincere. At first the family felt some constraint in intercourse with Prince Andrew. He seemed a man from another world, and for a long time Natásha trained the family to get used to him, proudly assuring them all that he only appeared to be different, but was really just like all of them, and that she was not afraid of him and no one else ought to be. He could talk about rural economy with the Count, fashions with the Countess and Natásha, and about albums and fancy work with Sónya. Sometimes the household, both among themselves and in his presence, expressed their wonder at how it had all happened, and at the evident omens there had been of it. Prince Andrew's coming to Otrádnoe and their coming to Petersburg, and the likeness between Natásha and Prince Andrew which her nurse had noticed on his first visit, and Andrew's encounter with Nicholas in 1805, and many other incidents betokening that it had to be. In the house, that poetic dullness and quiet reigned which always accompanies the presence of a betrothed couple. Often, when all sitting together, everyone kept silent. Sometimes the others would get up and go away, and the couple, left alone, still remained silent. They rarely spoke of their future life. Prince Andrew was afraid and ashamed to speak of it. Natásha shared this, as she did all his feelings, which she constantly divined. Once she began questioning him about his son. Prince Andrew blushed, as he often did now. Natásha particularly liked it in him, and said that his son would not live with him. "Why not?" asked Natásha in a frightened tone. "I cannot take him away from his grandfather, and besides—" "How I should have loved him," said Natásha, immediately guessing his thought, "but I know you wish to avoid any pretext for finding fault with us." Sometimes the old count would come up, kiss Prince Andrew, and ask his advice about Pétya's education or Nicholas's service. The old countess sighed as she looked at them. Sónya was always getting frightened lest she should be in the way and tried to find excuses for leaving them alone, even when they did not wish it. When Prince Andrew spoke, he could tell a story very well. Natásha listened to him with pride. When she spoke, she noticed with fear and joy that he gazed attentively and scrutinizingly at her. She asked herself in perplexity, "What does he look for in me? He is trying to discover something by looking at me. What if what he seeks in me is not there?" Sometimes she fell into one of the mad, merry moods characteristic of her, and then she particularly loved to hear and see how Prince Andrew laughed. He seldom laughed, but when he did, he abandoned himself entirely to his laughter. And after such a laugh, she always felt nearer to him. Natásha would have been completely happy if the thought of the separation awaiting her and drawing near had not terrified her, just as the mere thought of it made him turn pale and cold. On the eve of his departure from Petersburg, Prince Andrew brought with him Pierre, who had not been to the Rostóvs once since the ball. Pierre seemed disconcerted and embarrassed. He was talking to the Countess, and Natásha sat down beside a little chess table with Sónya, thereby inviting Prince Andrew to come too. He did so. "You have known Bezúkhov a long time?" he asked. "Do you like him?" "Yes, he's a dear, but very absurd." And as usual when speaking of Pierre, she began to tell anecdotes of his absent-mindedness, some of which had even been invented about him. "Do you know, I have entrusted him with our secret. I have known him from childhood. He has a heart of gold. I beg you, Natalia," Prince Andrew said with sudden seriousness, "I am going away and heaven knows what may happen. You may cease to... All right, I know I am not to say that. Only this then, whatever may happen to you when I am not here. What can happen? Whatever trouble may come," Prince Andrew continued, "I beg you, Mademoiselle Sophie, whatever may happen, to turn to him alone for advice and help. He is a most absent-minded and absurd fellow, but he has a heart of gold." Neither her father nor her mother, nor Sónya nor Prince Andrew himself, could have foreseen how the separation from her lover would act on Natásha. Flushed and agitated, she went about the house all that day, dry-eyed, occupied with most trivial matters as if not understanding what awaited her. She did not even cry when, on taking leave, he kissed her hand for the last time. "Don't go," she said in a tone that made him wonder whether he really ought not to stay, and which he remembered long afterwards. Nor did she cry when he was gone, but for several days she sat in her room dry-eyed, taking no interest in anything, and only saying now and then, "Oh, why did he go away?" But a fortnight after his departure, to the surprise of those around her, she recovered from her mental sickness just as suddenly and became her old self again, but with a change in her moral physiognomy, as a child gets up after a long illness with a changed expression of face. End of chapter 24. Recording by Wet Coast, Vancouver. Book 6, Chapter 25. Read for LibriVox.org by Wet Coast. During that year after his son's departure, Prince Nicholas Bolkónski's health and temper became much worse. He grew still more irritable, and it was Princess Mary who generally bore the brunt of his frequent fits of unprovoked anger. He seemed carefully to seek out her tender spots so as to torture her mentally as harshly as possible. Princess Mary had two passions, and consequently two joys, her nephew, little Nicholas, and religion, and these were the favorite subjects of the prince's attacks and ridicule. Whatever was spoken of he would bring round to the superstitiousness of old maids or the petting and spoiling of children. "You want to make him, little Nicholas, into an old maid like yourself. A pity! Prince Andrew wants a son and not an old maid," he would say. Or, turning to Mademoiselle Bourienne, he would ask her in Princess Mary's presence how she liked our village priests and icons, and would joke about them. He continually hurt Princess Mary's feelings and tormented her, but it cost her no effort to forgive him. Could he be to blame toward her, or could her father, whom she knew loved her in spite of it all, be unjust? And what is justice? The princess never thought of that proud word, justice. All the complex laws of man centered for her in one clear and simple law, the law of love and self-sacrifice, taught us by him who lovingly suffered for mankind, though he himself was God. What had she to do with the justice or injustice of other people? She had to endure and love, and that she did. During the winter Prince Andrew had come to Bald Hills, and had been gay, gentle, and more affectionate than Princess Mary had known him for a long time past. She felt that something had happened to him, but he said nothing to her about his love. Before he left he had a long talk with his father about something, and Princess Mary noticed that before his departure they were dissatisfied with one another. Soon after Prince Andrew had gone, Princess Mary wrote to her friend Julie Karagina in Petersburg, whom she had dreamed, as all girls dream, of marrying to her brother, and who was at that time in mourning for her own brother, killed in Turkey. "Sorrow, it seems, is our common lot, my dear, tender friend Julie. Your loss is so terrible that I can only explain it to myself as a special providence of God who, loving you, wishes to try you and your excellent mother. O my friend, religion, and religion alone, can, I will not say comfort us, but save us from despair. Religion alone can explain to us what, without its help, man cannot comprehend. Why, for what cause, kind and noble beings, able to find happiness in life, not merely harming no one, but necessary to the happiness of others, are called away to God, while cruel, useless, harmful persons, or such as are a burden to themselves and to others, are left living. The first death I saw, and one I shall never forget, that of my dear sister-in-law, left that impression on me. Just as you asked Destiny why your splendid brother had to die, so I asked why that angel Louise, who not only never wronged anyone, but in whose soul there were never any unkind thoughts, had to die. And what do you think, dear friend? 5 years have passed since then, and already I, with my petty understanding, begin to see clearly why she had to die, and in what way that death was but an expression of the infinite goodness of the Creator, whose every action, though generally incomprehensible to us, is but a manifestation of his infinite love for his creatures. Perhaps, I often think, she was too angelically innocent to have the strength to perform all a mother's duties. As a young wife she was irreproachable. Perhaps she could not have been so as a mother. As it is, not only has she left us, and particularly Prince Andrew, with the purest regrets and memories, but probably she will there receive a place I dare not hope for myself. But not to speak of her alone, that early and terrible death has had the most beneficent influence on me and on my brother in spite of all our grief. Then, at the moment of our loss, these thoughts could not occur to me. I should then have dismissed them with horror, but now they are very clear and certain. I write all this to you, dear friend, only to convince you of the gospel truth which has become for me a principle of life. Not a single hair of our heads will fall without his will. And his will is governed only by infinite love for us, and so whatever befalls us is for our good. You ask whether we shall spend next winter in Moscow. In spite of my wish to see you, I do not think so, and do not want to do so. You will be surprised to hear that the reason for this is Bonaparte. The case is this: my father's health is growing noticeably worse. He cannot stand any contradiction, and is becoming irritable. This irritability is, as you know, chiefly directed to political questions. He cannot endure the notion that Bonaparte is negotiating on equal terms with all the sovereigns of Europe, and particularly with our own, the grandson of the great Catherine. As you know, I am quite indifferent to politics, but from my father's remarks and his talks with Michael Ivanovitch, I know all that goes on in the world, and especially about the honors conferred on Bonaparte, who only at Bald Hills in the whole world, it seems, is not accepted as a great man, still less as Emperor of France, and my father cannot stand this. It seems to me that it is chiefly because of his political views that my father is reluctant to speak of going to Moscow, for he foresees the encounters that would result from his way of expressing his views regardless of anybody. All the benefit he might derive from a course of treatment he would lose as a result of the disputes about Bonaparte, which would be inevitable. In any case, it will be decided very shortly. Our family life goes on in the old way except for my brother Andrew's absence. He, as I wrote you before, has changed very much of late. After his sorrow he only this year quite recovered his spirits. He has again become as I used to know him when a child, kind, affectionate, with that heart of gold to which I know no equal. He has realized, it seems to me, that life is not over for him, but together with this mental change he has grown physically much weaker. He has become thinner and more nervous. I am anxious about him and glad he is taking this trip abroad which the doctors recommended long ago. I hope it will cure him. You write that in Petersburg he is spoken of as one of the most active, cultivated, and capable of the young men. Forgive my vanity as a relation, but I never doubted it. The good he has done to everybody here, from his peasants up to the gentry, is incalculable. On his arrival in Petersburg he received only his due. I always wonder at the way rumors fly from Petersburg to Moscow, especially such false ones as that you write about. I mean the report of my brother's betrothal to the little Rostova. I do not think my brother will ever marry again, and certainly not her, and this is why. First, I know that though he rarely speaks about the wife he has lost, the grief of that loss has gone too deep in his heart for him ever to decide to give her a successor, and our little angel a stepmother. Secondly, because, as far as I know, that girl is not the kind of girl who could please Prince Andrew. I do not think he would choose her for a wife, and frankly, I do not wish it. But I am running on too long, and am at the end of my second sheet. Goodbye, my dear friend. May God keep you in his holy and mighty care. My dear friend, Mademoiselle Bourrienne, sends you kisses. Mary. End of chapter 25. Recording by Wet Coast, Vancouver.
Chapter 26 of War and Peace, Book 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ashwin Jain. War and Peace, Book 6 by Leo Tolstoy. Chapter 26. In the middle of the summer, Princess Mary received an unexpected letter from Prince Andrew in Switzerland, in which he gave her strange and surprising news. He informed her of his engagement to Natasha Rostova. The whole letter breathed loving rapture for his betrothed and tender and confiding affection for his sister. He wrote that he had never loved as he did now, and that only now did he understand and know what life was. He asked his sister to forgive him for not having told her of his resolve when he had last visited Bald Hills, though he had spoken of it to his father. He had not done so for fear Princess Mary should ask her father to give his consent, irritating him and having to bear the brunt of his displeasure without attaining her object. Besides, he wrote, the matter was not so definitely settled as it is now. My father then insisted on a delay of a year, and now already 6 months, half of that period, have passed, and my resolution is firmer than ever. If the doctors did not keep me here at the spas, I should be back in Russia, but as it is, I have to postpone my return for 3 months. You know me and my relations with father. I want nothing from him. I have been and always shall be independent. But to go against his will and arouse his anger, now that he may perhaps remain with us such a short time, would destroy half my happiness. I am now writing to him about the same question, and beg you to choose a good moment to hand him the letter, and to let me know how he looks at the whole matter, and whether there is hope that he may consent to reduce the term by 4 months. After long hesitations, doubts, and prayers, Princess Mary gave the letter to her father. The next day the old prince said to her quietly, "Write and tell your brother to wait till I am dead. It won't be long. I shall soon set him free." The princess was about to reply, but her father would not let her speak, and, raising his voice more and more, cried, "Mary, Mary, my boy, a good family, clever people, eh? Rich, eh? Yes, a nice stepmother little Nicholas will have. Write and tell him that he may marry tomorrow if he likes. She'll be little Nicholas' stepmother, and I will marry Voyna. Ha ha ha. He mustn't be without a stepmother either. Only one thing, no more women are wanted in my house. Let him marry and live by himself. Perhaps you will go and live with him too?" He added, turning to Princess Mary, "Go in heaven's name. Go out into the frost, the frost, the frost." After his outburst, the prince did not speak any more about the matter, but a repressed vexation at his son's poor spirit's behavior found expression in his treatment of his daughter. To his former pretexts for irony a fresh one was now added, allusions to stepmothers and amiabilities to Mademoiselle Bourienne. "Why shouldn't I marry her?" he asked his daughter. "She'll make a splendid princess." And latterly, to her surprise and bewilderment, Princess Mary noticed that her father was really associating more and more with the Frenchwoman. She wrote to Prince Andrew about the reception of his letter, but comforted him with hopes of reconciling their father to their idea. Little Nicholas and his education, her brother Andrew, and religion were Princess Mary's joys and consolations. But besides that, since everyone must have personal hopes, Princess Mary, in the profoundest depths of her heart, and a hidden dream and hope that supplied the chief consolation of her life. This comforting dream and hope were given by her God's folk, the half-witted and other pilgrims who visited her without the prince's knowledge. The longer she lived, the more experience and observation she had of life, the greater was her wonder at the short-sightedness of men who seek enjoyment and happiness here on earth, toiling, suffering, struggling, and harming one another to obtain that impossible visionary, sinful happiness. Prince Andrew had loved his wife. She died. But that was not enough. He wanted to bind his happiness to another woman. Her father objected to this because he wanted a more distinguished and wealthier match for Andrew. And they all struggled and suffered and tormented one another and injured their souls. Their eternal souls, for the attainment of benefits which endure but for an instant. Not only do we know this ourselves, but Christ, the Son of God, came down to earth and told us that his life is but for a moment and is a probation. Yet we cling to it and think to find happiness in it. How is it that no one realizes this? Thought Princess Mary. No one except these despised God's folk, wallet on back, come to me by the back door, afraid of being seen by the prince, not for fear of ill usage by him, but for fear of causing him to sin. To leave family, home, and all the cares of worldly welfare, in order without clinging to anything to wander in hempen rags from place to place under an assumed name, doing no one any harm but praying for all, for those who drive one away as well as for those who protect one. Higher than that life and truth there is no life or truth. There was one pilgrim, a quite pockmarked little woman of 50 called Theodosia, who for over 30 years had gone about barefoot and worn heavy chains. Princess Mary was particularly fond of her. Once, when in a room with a lamp dimly lit before the icon, Theodosia was talking of her life. The thought that Theodosia alone had found the true path of life suddenly came to Princess Mary with such force that she resolved to become a pilgrim herself. When Theodosia had gone to sleep, Princess Mary thought about this for a long time, and at last made up her mind that, strange as it might seem, she must go on a pilgrimage. She disclosed this thought to no one but to her confessor, Father Akinfi, the monk, and he approved of her intention. Under guise of a present for the pilgrims, Princess Mary prepared a pilgrim's complete costume for herself: a coarse smock, bast shoes, a rough coat, and a black kerchief. Often, approaching the chest of drawers containing its secret treasure, Princess Mary paused, uncertain whether time had not already come to her project into execution. Often, listening to the pilgrims' tales, she was so stimulated by their simple speech, mechanical to them but was so full of deep meaning, that several times she was on the point of abandoning everything and running away from home. In imagination she already pictured herself by Theodosia's side, dressed in coarse rags, walking with a staff, wallet on her back, along the dusty road, directing her wanderings from one saint's shrine to another, free from envy, earthly love or desire, and reaching at last the place where there is no more sorrow or sighing, but eternal joy and bliss. I shall come to a place and pray there, and before having time to get used to it or getting to love it, I shall go farther. I will go on till my legs fail, and I will lie down and die somewhere, and shall at last reach that eternal quiet haven, where there is neither sorrow nor sighing, thought Princess Mary. But afterwards, when she saw her father and especially little Coco, Nicholas, her resolve weakened. She wept quietly and felt that she was a sinner who loved her father and little nephew more than God. End of chapter 26. Recording by Ashwin Jain. End of War and Peace, Book 6 by Leo Tolstoy.